So I'd like to introduce myself to you. I'm Kathryn Welch. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney, and my main field of study is Roman Republican political history. But I always say about Roman women, no course about them or without them. To me, they are an integral part of the story, and particularly so because my main field of study is the Roman Republic at the pointy end when in the first century before the Common Era, it fell into disarray, civil war, and the story of women in this last century, the last 50 years of the Roman Republic and the first 50 years of what we call the Roman Empire, although what we really mean is autocratic rule, are a story of transition that involves women in a very interesting way. But I'd like to say is, although in this period women come out of the woodwork and we get more evidence for what is going on, my recent research shows me, and also the recent research of some other very interesting scholars, shows me that we're getting a picture of women in this time, and many of the aspects that we thought were connected only to civil war or the emergence of autocratic rule actually go way back in Roman history and are something about the society that we're studying rather than just a society in turmoil. So before I get on to the stuff of my lecture, as we always do with our lectures from the University of Sydney, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm delivering this lecture from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campus stands. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. All right. Now, just to dislocate us, I want to start not with Rome, but with 1870, British law, the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, just to remind us where we've come from in Australian society. Before 1870, any money made by a woman, either through a wage, from investment, by gift, or through inheritance, automatically became the property of her husband once she was married. Thus, the identity of the wife became legally absorbed into her husband, effectively making them one person under the law. Once a woman became married, her property was no longer her own, and her husband could choose to dispose of it whenever he thought suitable. Thus, a woman on marrying relinquished her personal property, movable property such as money, stocks, furniture, and livestock, to her husband's ownership. By law, he was permitted to dispose of it at will at any time in the marriage and could even will it away at death. Now, when we start to think about the history of women through the ages, we should never think, in my view, of a linear progression to the present day where women have a lot more freedom and can own their own property and to a large extent, in many cases, govern their own lives. We have to remember that this was British law until a little over a century ago. And that although things changed in 1870 and continued to change under the pressure of modifications to the Married Women's Property Act, that mentality governs the way a lot of our society operated and still does. Now, I want you to contrast that with a letter from 58 BCE, before the Common Era, from Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of the most famous Romans of his day and thereafter, to his wife, Terentia. Cicero is in exile, and Terentia is trying to help him while she's back in Rome. As to what you say in your letter, my dear Terentia, about your intention of selling the village, alas, in heaven's name, what will become of you? Now, Cicero and Terentia have been married by this stage for about 20 years. But note, Terentia owns a village. She's thinking of selling it to raise money for Cicero, and he cannot stop her. He can only ask her not to. The contrast could not be starker. Terentia can decide what's going to happen to her property. And Terentia has a lot of property to decide what to do with. Now, not for 1 minute do I want to suggest that Rome was a paradise for women. This was a highly gendered society. It was a society in which there was a concept of infimitas sexus, as they say in Latin, womanly weakness. Women by their nature, according to Roman law, women by their nature were not strong enough in the brain capacity to be able to govern their own property. That was in law. So women never came out of minority. I think that's possibly the way to think about it. Women were at law regarded as minors. So they were placed in tutela, guardianship, on the death of their father, where young men were also in guardianship until they put on the white gown, the gown of manhood, at the age of 14 or so. And then they were considered adults at 14, just think about that. Women at law were considered perpetual minors. So tutela muliebris, the guardianship of women, was a thing at law that once a woman's father had died, she remained part of, including Terentia. So keep that in mind. It's by no means, as I said, an equal society. However, according to the law of the 12 tables, although women were in permanent guardianship, they inherited property. They were part of the familia, the family, and on the death of a father, that property was divided equally between all siblings. The difference was that men could then decide what they were going to do with that property, whereas women received property but remained under guardianship. But ownership of property is actually key. Women being part of the inheritance structure and Rome having what we call a partitive inheritance structure is the central, I think, sociological fact that is going to make a difference to everything down the track. Because what happened was, through a process we don't entirely understand, is that guardianship weakened. In early Roman society, women inherited, as I've said, but the guardian came from her natal family, her birth family. That weakened to the point where a guardian could come from pretty well anywhere, and a woman, if she found a guardian unhelpful, could ask for another one. So as guardianship weakens, as it does, we think through the 3rd and 2nd century, a woman's say in what she does with her property, because she's got it and it's hers, became a little bit more possible. So Terentia has a guardian, but Cicero doesn't ask the guardian about her property, he asks Terentia. So we can actually see that this inheritance structure and the fact that women own property, of course of varying amounts, is really key. And it's key to a lot of things. It still meant Roman women could not vote. It still meant that Roman women could not stand for office. It still meant that Roman women were in many respects confined by social mores, but they could own things, unlike women in Britain until 1870, if they were married. And I'd like to show you a portrait of a not famous woman. We don't know her name. We don't know anything about her. She is an old woman from a town close to Rome who had enough money to put a funeral portrait up at her tomb. Look at that face and tell me if whoever carved it ever thought about womanly weakness. This kind of portrait is common. So women are not only owners of property, they are among those, if they have enough property, and not everybody did, that could be commemorated. And this is how they chose to commemorate themselves, or how their relatives chose to commemorate them. Anyone thinking of Mrs. Danvers, for example, from Rebecca, or any other really interesting. I mean, I would like to take this portrait and paint it to get the real force of this face. And the more I look at it, as I have done often in Rome when we were able to go there in the Palazzo Massimo Museum, the more I think, yeah, Roman women are worth observing. Now, let's go into one area of where women in antiquity generally were usually considered important. Let's get this one out of the way reasonably quickly. Women were important to religion, very important. They were important to religion in various Greek city-states. They were important to religion in various other ways. In most Mediterranean pantheistic cultures, women had a role to play because women were regarded there as part of the makeup of the natural world and the makeup of the divine force that governed the universal order. In Rome, this took an interesting form as well. So the most famous of the participants of Roman religion, female participants, are the Vestal Virgins. I'm going to call them Vestal priests. Yes, they were virgins. Okay, that's fine. They're actually probably the only priestly college for whom virginity was required. And there's a whole lot of you could give a whole lecture on the Vestal Virgins. They're sociologically and historically very interesting. But I want to make the point here that the Vestal priests were priests. They were part not just of a subservient element of Roman religion, they were integral to Roman religion. They were integral. And their integral nature is best exemplified, for example, in the bottom picture, whereby you see this statue of the Virgines Maximi, the chief virgins, who are, I'll come back to those questions as we go through, but if you wouldn't mind, is it okay if I leave questions till the end? Thank you. And can I be heard? Is the sound okay? Thank you. This row of statues of the chief virgins is right off the Roman Forum. Their house was integral to the Forum. The temple of Vesta that they tended was integral to the Forum. Okay, so it's right there in the very center of the political and social heart of the city. The rather formidable, another formidable woman just above is a chief virgin. Interestingly, their dress was very particular, and it was the dress of a matron, but the headdress of a bride, as though they were liminal between married and not married. Okay? And then we also see them from an imperial carving. There's the 6 of them at a feast. They attended public banquets, public feasts. They were visible to the community. In the old days, people tended to think of Vestal Virgins as either nuns or people you could dress up for Roman orgies. They were neither. They were respectable, often highborn women who were integral to the way that Romans celebrated festivals, the way that they conducted sacrifice, and the way that they manifested in public exhibition, procession, all the rest of it. Special seats at the games for the Vestal Virgins down the front. They were front and center of Roman political, religious, and social life. Now, but they weren't the only members of the priestly apparatus of Rome that were important. So there were these priests that you may not know so much about, the flamines, these priests which were dedicated to a particular god. And the 3 most important were Jupiter, the main god of Rome, Mars, the god of war, the father of Romulus and Remus by legend, and Quirinus, who is actually Romulus, the founder of Rome, deified. So the 3 central integral divine features of Rome all had this special priest. But the interesting thing about this priesthood is it's a married priesthood. And so the wives of all 3 flamines, all 3 flamen, were more or less not just wives, they were partner priests. And so they have a role in ritual as well. And so the Vestal Virgins, while they're important and fascinating, and as I said, there's a whole story to tell about them, what I want to concentrate on at the moment is the role for married women the role for married women as wives of public figures, these wives are regarded as part of the team. They just don't turn up. They have a ritual role, they have duties, they have public visibility. And of course, they are also governed by various rules, as the Flamines were, the men. They are governed by rules, ritual rules that pertain to their office. This was the case too of any wife of a leading magistrate. So Rome had a system of annual elections during the Republic, and every year you elected a series of magistrates, and the two top guys are the consuls and the praetors, and they have religious duties, as do their wives. So once a guy got the honour of being the top bloke for the year, his wife automatically became prominent and was tasked with various duties. And of course, this gave her the chance to shine among women. Okay, so all of this means that the rhythm of Roman festival and social and ritual, and as a result, political life included women separately, but they were there. Now, let's just get another important element of this story under our belts. Let's think about how the Roman family was constructed, because we have to see how women fit into that, especially if wives have a particular role to play in the public life. I'm not going to say political life always, although they did play a role in politics, but in public life. So how does the Roman family work? Well, not like ours. The Romans have two concepts. You have the concept of the domus, which is the house, which was a physical building, but it was also a concept. Okay, the domus, just like we get the House of Windsor or the House of Hanover, the domus is actually the group of people that live in the house, and the big guys, the ones we know most about, formed these huge edifices, and a whole range of people lived within that house. The other word is familia, and it looks like our word family, but it shouldn't be, it's not the same as our word family. There's a difference. The familia in Rome is the family plus, and involves, this is really critical, all those under the power of the paterfamilias, the father of the house. And now this is a patrilineal, patriarchal society. And the father actually has the right of life and death to choose whether to live or to die. That's the choice he has by law over those in his familia. Now, who did they include? His children, male and female, for as long as he lived. Young men could attain manhood, but they were not emancipated from their father unless through his death or by a special law whereby they might have been emancipated and sold out of the house. Okay, so you stayed under the, what we call patria potestas, the legal power of the father, for as long as you lived, whether you were male or female. Except, okay, I'll come to an except in a moment. But just keep that in mind, the power of the father. Now, if a woman married, and we use the term here in manu, that is by the hand. If you passed from the hand of your father to the hand of your husband, then you became part of your husband's familia. However, this is really, really, really important. Most women were not married in manu. They were married by a different form that became common round about the 3rd, 2nd century BCE. We're not quite sure. No one set out a handbook on this. We can only observe it through the evidence we have. Most women were married by this concept of usus, which is a kind of simple marriage. It was a legal marriage for the production of legitimate children, but without entering into the hand of your husband. In other words, you stayed under the power of your father. You stayed within the inheritance structure of your father. You stayed, to all intents and purposes, your father's daughter, not your husband's clutch. You're outside it. And this simple marriage, the Romans were very concrete in how they approached law. Okay, this simple marriage involved the symbolism and, in fact, the legal reality that a wife had to spend 3 nights a year out of her husband's house. If she didn't, she automatically came under his power. But there's 3 nights somewhere else. Go to stay with mum, go down the road to your own place, whatever. You moved out of your husband's house for 3 nights a year as a kind of legal claim to the fact that you were not part of his familia. You were his legitimate legal wife, but you were not part of his familia. You were still part of your father's inheritance structure. And Roman fathers tended to die while you were quite young. And when your father died, you were not in patria potestas anymore. You were your own person, though you had a guardian. A guardian who, as we've seen, maybe didn't matter that much or maybe did. So the possibilities you can see are that a wife was of the domus, but she wasn't of the familia of her husband. And even when she was in Manu, she was what we call in the place of a daughter, because there was no legal concept that a wife, per se, as a wife, was part of her husband's familia, which was part of her father's familia. And once her father died, all members of that family came under their own law, although some of them might be in guardianship. There's no primogeniture here. It's an equal way. Okay, all right. So what this means is that the matroni, the married women of Rome, are a group. They have a specific status. They inherit from their fathers. They can do other things as well. And many of them are independent from their husbands in terms of their property. Now, this one, we do know her name. Her name is Vicaria, and she's from Herculaneum, and she's the mother of the most important citizen that Herculaneum produced, and she gets a statue in his basilica along with the rest of her family. Have a look at that face too, and tell me about womanly weakness. Okay, so this separation of powers. This is a very interesting point to make, and it again lies at the heart of what we're talking about. Within marriage, separation of property was almost complete. In fact, there were laws making it impossible for wives and husbands to swap gifts as a means of getting out of legal obligations or taxes or whatever. Okay, so a woman's property remained separate from her husband's. Even a dowry, okay, a dowry was important, a husband could use it, but it was still conceptualized as a wife's property. And he could use it, but in the event of a divorce, for example, that dowry was meant to be returned. However, because she couldn't control it in the same way that she could control other property, in uncertain situations, civil war, the downfall of a husband due to political extermination or whatever, a woman's dowry was at risk. Okay, that was the bit he could control. He could make use of the usufruct. It was more or less his until the marriage dissolved, which, by the way, was very easy because you could just move out in this simple form of marriage. But that's only part of the story. Any other wealth, inheritance, business interests, real property belonged to a woman and was not normally affected by her husband's fate. Think about that. Just think about that. Here we have a society which, because of the evolution of property law, inheritance, and marriage, means that women are to a certain extent preserved from the fate of their husband. So we think back to Cicero and Terentia. He is in exile. She can decide whether her property can be put to use to get him back to Rome or not. It doesn't automatically disappear because he has suffered this tremendous disaster. Now, let's just think about that. We've got a gendered society with among the sort of group I'm talking about, the political class, the property class, but I think this will go down, just it'll change with each different economic stratum of society. But this group of women that heads Roman society, that sits alongside, stands alongside the aristocracy of merit that we have, whereby you had to go through the electoral process to reaffirm your status, then these women will live separate but very interesting lives. So I now want to take you into the idea of the group of women and the hierarchy in amongst them that runs along parallel with the political life of their menfolk. So just a little vignette from Lucan, the poet Lucan, who writes about the Roman Civil War. And at the beginning of the Civil War, as they're fearing that Julius Caesar will bring his troops down through Italy and attack the city, he gives us this tiny little vision of the women reacting to the news of an army moving through Italy and towards the city. And he says, every woman came out of her house to pray to the gods. And he has this, nor did they all prostrate themselves in the temple of the supreme thunderer, that's Jupiter. They divided the gods among themselves, and no altar lacked a mother to call down shame upon it. I give this lovely picture of Livy standing there in the pose of someone praying to the gods. Okay. Now, it's an innocent little line in a poem, but it shows you the organizational power of these women. No altar lacked a mother to call, and this is a sort of impromptu action. So what it means is the organization of these women has to sit behind this no altar lacked a mother. They must have met and divided up and taken groups of women to each of Rome's temples, and there were hundreds of them, to make sure that someone could supplicate any of the gods who might help them in this moment of absolute terror. So let's think about Rome's mothers. They dominate the tradition of early Rome. And one of the most famous that you might know about if you know your Shakespeare is going to be what Shakespeare calls Volumnia, but in fact, he gets that wrong. Well, he didn't get it wrong. Plutarch got it wrong and he just copied Plutarch. But Veturia, the mother of Coriolanus. Way back in the 5th century, the story of Coriolanus is that, of course, Coriolanus gets exiled from Rome as well. His mum's back in the city. Everybody goes to Coriolanus and says, please, Coriolanus, do not leave the Volsci against Rome. We really don't want you to do this. And he refused to listen to the priests. He refused to listen to the senators. He refused to listen to everyone else. But when the women turn up, led by his mum, and his mum says, don't do this, son, he says, all right, mum, and went home. Great story. Now, most of the time, I've done a big study of this, most of the time Veturia is pictured as kneeling and supplicating her son not to attack the city. In the historian Livy, no way. And this painting really gets Livy's Veturia magnificently. And you can see Coriolanus sitting there looking away, not daring to look at his mum. She's standing there saying, you, your army, and the rest of you, get lost. That's Rome. How dare you attack the city of your birth, even if you got a little bit unjustly treated by it. It's marvelous. And if we look then at Livy's account, we actually see once again, although it's much more elaborately told in other authors, but Livy gives you 2 chapters of absolute concentrated emotion and power on the part of not just Veturia, but the women who went to Veturia to ask her to do this. The matrons went in a body to Veturia, the mother of Coriolanus, and Volumnia, his wife. Whether this was a consequence of a decree of the Senate or simply the prompting of womanly fear, I am unable to ascertain. But at all events, they succeeded in inducing the aged Veturia to go with Volumnia and her 2 little sons to the enemy's camp. As men were powerless to protect the city by their arms, the women sought to do so by their tears and prayers. On their arrival at the camp, a message was sent to Coriolanus that a large body of women were present. He had remained unmoved by the majesty of the state in the persons of its ambassadors, and by the appeal made to his eyes and the minds of the persons of its priests. He was even more obdurate to the tears of the women until he saw Mum. And Mum wasn't crying, as I said. Mum was simply commanding. If you want to read more, you see the reference there, Livy Book 2, Chapter 40. It's really brilliant stuff. But I want to bring out for the moment, not just Veturia and her great story, but the story of the women gathering together. Now that's a legend. If we go down to 42, the period of civil war, the period just after the death of Julius Caesar, we see exactly the same thing happening in the historian Appian, who talks about Hortensia and the women of Rome, who are going to be subject to a new collection of money by the successors of Julius Caesar so that they can fight their civil war. And so when the women are about to be taxed by this new tax, well, reinvented tax, note what happens. The women resolved to beseech the women of the triumvirs. With the sister of Julius Caesar and the mother of Antonius, they did not fail, but they were repulsed from the doors of Fulvia, the wife of Antonius, whose rudeness they could scarce endure. They then pushed their way through to the tribunal of the triumvirs in the forum, the people and the guards dividing to let them pass. There, through the mouth of Hortensia, whom they had elected to speak, they spoke as follows: "As has been fitting for women of our rank, when making a request of you, we had recourse to the ladies of your households. But having been treated by Fulvia in a way that was not appropriate to us, we have been driven together to the forum." And then she gives her speech. Now, you might think Appian just makes it up. But in fact, we know from the author Quintilian that Hortensia's speech was famous, it was published, and it was famous, and she was not the only one. We were told that the eloquence of the Gracchi owed much to their mother, Cornelia, whose letters even today testify to the cultivation of her style. Laelia, the daughter of Gaius Laelius, is said to have reproduced the elegance of her father's language in her own speech, while the oration delivered before the triumvirs by Hortensia, the daughter of Quintus Hortensius, one of Rome's most famous orators, by the way, is still read, and not merely as a compliment to her sex. It's good. And we don't just think about it as good for a woman, it's good. And Quintilian taught rhetoric. We have other stories, stories of the Sabine women that you might know from, because it's quite famous. That is, back in the legendary days of Rome, when there were no women in the city, Romulus decided that the best way was to invite all the neighbours and their daughters and then just steal the women. Not recommended as a process of marriage today. Now, of course, these women became the founding mothers of Rome. And Livy again tells the story. Look at the way he does it. These women have been abducted and they're pretty upset. But notice he says despondent and indignant. They're not just fearful, they're angry. They're angry. Now, what happens? Did they just get beaten on the head and married? No, not quite, not quite. Romulus, however, went around in person, says Livy, and pointed out to them that it was all owing to the pride of their parents in denying the right of intermarriage to their neighbours. They would live in honourable wedlock and share all their property and civil rights, and dearest of all to human nature would be the mothers of free men. He begged them to lay aside their feelings of resentment and give their affections to those whom fortune had made masters of their persons. An injury had often led to reconciliation and love. They would find their husbands all the more affectionate because each would do his utmost so far as it lay in him to make up for the loss of parents and country. Okay, yeah, we abducted you. You know, that's true, we did. But, you know, we really just want to marry you. Now, as I said, it's not great. It would not stack up today. But interestingly, in this society where a woman, at least in her first marriage, had very little say, and her father has got the right and life and death over her and usually decided who she married at least the first time around. We've got evidence to say women had more say maybe later on. This is a very interesting thing to say. We have to judge it on its own terms. Please, you know, we really like you. Give us a chance and, you know, maybe you'll come to like us. It's not a case of just, as I said, abduct them, marry them, that's all. He's actually persuading. He feels the need for persuasion. And if we, sorry, I just press the wrong button. This wonderful coin from the early 1st century BCE of abducting the Sabine women. Now, of course, it's a coin and it's just a depiction. But I really like it because although one woman is looking down, you might notice the other one has her head turned around and she's looking straight back up at the guy who's carrying her off. And I hope she's screaming at him. I really hope she's screaming at him. And you know what? I've had a close look at that coin. I think she is. So this group of women, Nicholas Purcell in 1986 on an article on Livy tried to outline what we think is happening here, although we've got no text that actually explicate it. And this is the Ordo Matronarum, the order of women, the kind of ordered formal arrangement of Roman women. In the Roman past, especially as interpreted and transmitted by Livy, the women of the city had played a public role on many occasions. In moments of crisis, they acted in concert to intercede with the gods. We've seen that. Their role officially expressed public grief, which we met at the funeral of Drusus, which I haven't talked about, but Purcell does. Goes right back to the last rites of the first consuls of the Republic in Livy, or to the exequies of Sulla and Julius Caesar. And we've got other descriptions. They might help in more mundane ways by the gift of their adornments. Thus, this group of women at the time of the Gallic sack decided to contribute to the needs of the state, and so on and so forth. The episode of Hortensia and the triumvirs is also of great interest. So we see this happening time and again in Roman history, in Roman texts. And we have to look behind it. Now, why haven't we known this before? Why does it take someone like Purcell in 1986 to realize this? And I think it's something to do with the culture that we come with to the study of Roman history. We either don't even notice them, which was the old way, or we expect that they must be completely under the thumb, which is, I think, what was happening in the 1970s and 1980s in scholarship. But instead, once we start to look at how Roman women operate in their own terms, we get some amazing things happening. So for the last little while in this lecture, I want to give you just a few episodes that show us individuals operating on their own terms. So this one, for example, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, victor in a civil war. The daughter seems to have cleaned up in the property bonanza that happened after the civil war, for reasons I'll go into in a moment. For at Baiae near Cape Misenum, Marius owned an expensive house. Don't worry so much about the background. It's the amount, it's the figures we're looking at here, which had appointments more luxurious and more effeminate, that became a man, blah, 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 blah. This house, we are told, Cornelia bought for 75,000 drachmas, and not long afterwards, Lucius Lucullus purchased it for 2,500,000. Now, don't worry about how much a drachma is actually worth. Just look at the profit she will have made on that sale. Not bad. This one is also fascinating. Licinia is a Vestal virgin who gets accused of unchastity. And how does she get off? And how does her friend Marcus Crassus get off, who was actually thought to be her correspondent? Now, Licinia was the owner of a pleasant villa in the suburbs, which Crassus wished to get at a low price. And it was thought for this reason that he was forever hovering about the woman and paying his court to her until he fell under the abominable suspicion. And in a way, it was his avarice that absolved him from the charge of corrupting a Vestal, and he was acquitted by the judges. No, he wasn't hanging around to see if he could have sex with her. He was trying to buy a property at a low price. Now, what do we read behind this story? Vestals owned property. They owned a lot of property, and they were doing the deals themselves. Vestals, by the way, did not have guardians. Vestals at law could make a will, they could own property, they could be very, very rich. And as Vestals, no problem about a husband getting any of the dowry. We look down the road at Pompeii and we see this in perhaps the turn of the Common Era. Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, public priestess in her own name and in that of her son Marcus Numicius Fronto, built a porch, a covered corridor, and a colonnade dedicated to Augustan Concord and to Pietas at her own expense. The same woman dedicated it. Now, this one's interesting because Eumachia's building in Pompeii, if we actually look at it, and I don't know whether my arrow will come up, but it's this building at the very right-hand end, the big one off the Forum. Here's the Forum of Pompeii. Here is Eumachia's building. That's a large building. Now, I want you to note the actual physical appearance of the inscription as to who is important. Look at the big letters in the top line. Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, sacerdos publica, public priesthood, nomine suo et, and then her son, who's the magistrate, is relegated to the second line. And if you know your Latin, he's not even in the nominative case. And in the name of her son. And then when we get down to a little bit of grammar, which is sociology, we see all the verbs are in the singular. So son is there, but he's in small letters on the second line, and she pays for it. She decides what it's about, and she pays for it. It's an extraordinary statement to her wealth, to her public standing, and to what she was able to do as a woman. And yet we read it as, oh, it's all about Marcus Numistrius Fronto because he's standing for office, which he did, and she couldn't. I don't think that's what that building is about. Okay, son gets to look in. Husband doesn't. No mention of husband. She's either kicked him out or he's died, but he's not there. In the proscriptions, the famous proscriptions that followed the death of Julius Caesar, that these triumvirs that we've already mentioned brought up, we get this. From Velleius Paterculus, who's writing in the Tiberian period, one thing, however, demands comment that towards the proscribed, their wives showed the greatest loyalty, their freedmen not a little, their slaves some, their sons none. Not quite fair to the sons, but we get there. Now, why? Why would the loyalty of wives be so important? Remember, their property is separate. Remember that if a man if he escapes and makes his way back, it's just a possibility that if his wife chooses, he can get a leg in back into the political arena with her money. But she has to consent. She has to decide to do it. So we get this from Appian, slightly different take. For some were not less fearful of their wives and ill-disposed children than of the butchers, the murderers, while others feared for their freedmen and their slaves. Creditors feared their debtors and neighbours feared neighbours who coveted their lands. So your wife could choose to help you, or she could choose not to help you. And this is why loyalty, the loyalty that was displayed, was so important. So here's a bad wife. I love Silassus's wife. We don't know her name, but we do know about her. Silassus was one of these guys caught up in the proscriptions. His house has been sold, and the only person to recognize him was the doorkeeper, who'd been sold along with the house. That's slavery for you. That's another lecture. Silassus told him to summon his wife from her house. No, she's got a house to go to. She said she would come in the morning. At daybreak, she went to fetch the butchers. Silassus feared that the doorkeeper had gone off to spring a trap on him. But when he saw not the doorkeeper, but his wife bringing the butchers back, he threw himself off the roof. Okay, so bad wife, not good. But her choice, and she's got somewhere to go. Good wife, good wife. Another woman whose name we don't know, but this is accidental. We're meant to know her name, we just simply don't. We call her Turia because there's another woman, Turia, whose story was very similar, but we really don't know. What you see there in a beautiful example of this inscription, 100 lines of Latin, which is an oration of a man for his dead wife, a wife who had been his wife for over 40 years and who had saved his life during the proscription. He meant her name to be there, but all we have is the remainder of the word uxoris, of the wife. Now note, if you're into gorgeous calligraphy, the beautiful lettering. This is an expensive monument. And I recommend my friend Josiah Osgood's book on this. If you want any kind of follow-up to my lecture today, have a look at his book. It's very accessible. Turia, a Roman woman's civil war. Now, I want to bring you down to the end of that inscription where he has told the story of their life. He's gone through all the things she's done, saved the house, saved his life, hid him in the roof so he didn't have to run out of the town in this moment of dire peril. And at the end, he says, I'm supposed to be brave, I'm supposed to be stoic. And he says, fortune has allowed your memory to become established with my words. But of all that tranquility that I have lost along with you, who were the warner and front fighter of my dangers, confronted with that calamity, I am shattered. Now, the word shattered there is an interesting word. So I'm going to inflict a tiny little bit of Latin on you. Come down to the very end there and you see the word frangor. He uses that word and that's what stands for I am shattered. It's a word used of the very moment that an army breaks up as it's defeated. It's the word used of a ship which has been attacked just before it sinks. This is where we find this word being used. I am utterly defeated, is what he's saying. And the other thing he can do is inject the whole thing with a military tone by using these wonderful words, speculatrix and propugnatrix. Now, we can't do it in English the way you can in Latin, to feminize these forms of front fighter and warner. The speculator were the guys that the speculatores went ahead and they made sure everything was safe. So you're my front fighter and you are my propugnator, or feminine propugnatrix. You are my bulwark. So you're my guard and my bulwark. And he gets the two of them. Now, this in a culture where men were supposed to do all the fighting and all the rest of men were supposed to be there and women were supposed to be weak and no brains. Note, he doesn't mind not just saying this in a narration for his wife at her death. He puts it up in stone. He put it up in stone and we found it and we've got most of it. We don't have all of it, but we've got most of it. It's an absolutely marvelous story. And as I said, my friend Josiah Osgood has done a really good treatment of it in his 2013 book. I also want to point out that these women lived a long time. If you could survive childbirth, which was by no means easy, you could live. And here's a list of women, and look at how long. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, living for most of the 2nd century. Sempronia, her daughter, also quite elderly at the time of her death. Livia, the wife of P. Rutilius Rufus, famous for living to the age of 95. Good on her. Servilia, the mother of Brutus, again long-lived. Terentia, back to Terentia, who we met in the first part of the lecture, allegedly lived to the age of 103, and after her divorce from Cicero in 47, married a couple of other people who might also have benefited from her money, outlived her children. Scribonia, the 3rd wife of Caesar Augustus, divorced on the day that her daughter was born, her daughter Julia, but lived on and was a leading light among the women of the early Augustan period. Livia, I could do a whole lecture on Livia. I've made this a Livia-free zone just to show you how rich this topic is. But Livia lives from 59 or 58, we're not sure, down to 29, well into her 80s. And she put her good health down to a glass of red wine from the Alto Adige, which she had every day. Good on her. Junia, the wife of Gaius Cassius, colleague of Brutus in the assassination of Julius Caesar, lived to the age of 22. He died in 42 at the Battle of Philippi, the First Battle of Philippi. She lives on for another 60 years as a leading light in the Augustan aristocracy. And the historian Tacitus gives a marvelous description of her funeral. So women are commemorated, and I'm going to leave you with these last images of female tombs. So here's the tomb of Caecilia Metella that many of you, if you've walked the Appian Road in Rome, will have met. It's on the rise of a hill, it's majestic, it's wonderful. Now, the scholars will say this is all about her family, it's all about the menfolk of the family, because she was related to some reasonably important men, but I'm saying rubbish. It's not their names on the inscription which we have. The inscription reads, to Caecilia, the daughter of Quintus Creticus, consul of 69, and the wife of Crassus. We don't even know which Crassus, though we're pretty sure, but we have to guess. The inscription doesn't tell us. The inscription is not about the men. It's about her. What did she do to deserve that? She lived through this period of civil war as well. Her son had to come back from the other side and then make his way in the new dispensation. What did she do? We don't know. We don't know, but she's got a really, really, really big tomb devoted just to her on the Appian Road on prime real estate. And to go back to Pompeii, here's Eumachia's tomb, the largest tomb outside the Noceran Gate. Absolutely huge to her. Not even young son Numistius Fronto gets a look in, although he might have been there, and certainly not husband. He's never anywhere. And I love this one too. Back to Rome from the 2nd century, where we actually see the tomb of what must have been a family that engaged in construction and reconstruction. I love the crane. I love the crane. I mean, occupational health and safety did not exist. You can see the poor little slave guys that are actually working the crane. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece of work. Note who it's for. The person gazing out of the pediment of this tomb is a woman, and the funeral is for a woman. She owned the company. She ran the company. It's her tomb, and she's in charge. Thanks very much. It's gone 12, so I think it might be time to stop, and I hope to see you all again. Thank you very much for listening.